In my reckoning, what makes Bordegism, as practiced by the International Communist Party and as picked up by communization theorists out of France, unique, begins in the draft theses for the third Congress of the Communist Party of Italy, presented by the left in Lyon under false conditions, where if non-shenanigans had not been pulled, this would have been adopted as a program. But it is where a lot of the things that are unique to Bordiga, as not just Leninism, really developed. Now, Bordiga would never admit that this is not just Leninism. Other people in the left faction, such as Dement, would develop this further, but nonetheless, I would definitely, before starting here on 10, where we actually get into the text, I would watch at least 1, 5 through 9 of the prior videos. You can probably skip some of the ones about Trotskyist critiques and maybe the broader history of Bordiga and why it's defensible. But in general, I would know this. I would go through that history because that context is going to matter. But this is the beginning of what will become the invariant faction of left communism, the Bordigist faction. It's not the only Italian faction, but it is significantly different from the Dutch and German left communists, or also significantly different from later left communists, which aren't really part of the tradition, such as Apparismo and Autonomia, are the heady view out of post-1968 France that created Jacques Camat, Gilles Devey, Trampoline, and communization theory from former Bordigists. We need to know that, and to understand a lot of the milieu of the left, even of the last 10 years, is a resurgence of the figure who was largely forgotten and poorly translated until Philippe Bourdonnais' book, The Bordigist Current, Lauren Goldner picking him up, and then Haymarket releasing a fairly good translation of key text with a very good and historically researched introduction. Let us begin the discussion of Bordiga. 1926. The draft theses for the Third Congress of the Communist Party of Italy, presented by the left, also known as the Lyon Theses of 1926. The Rome Theses voted on by the Second Congress of the Communist Party of Italy on March 26, 1922. You can find it. This text of the Congress was published in Comunista, number 67 in 1921, in Ordine Nouveau in 1922, and in Lavoratore, I think, number 4,960, in Rassegna Comunista, number 17, on the 30th of January 1922. A few changes were made to the first text of the Congress were published in Comunista number 95, 4/4/1922, and Laboratory 4014, 5/4/1922, and Ordine Nouveau 96, 6/4/1922. Okay. Theses on the tactics of the Communist International were presented at the Fourth Congress of the Communist International, published in number 16 of Stato Apparecchio in 1924. The Program of Action of the Communist Party of Italy, presented at the Fourth Congress of the Communist International. That's a common term, by the way. Published in the above-mentioned issue of the Stato Apparecchio. Motions and theses approved by the National Consultative Congresses of the Communist Party of Italy in May 1924, published in Stato Apparecchio, number 25, 1924. Theses on the tactics of the Communist International, presenting at the Fifth World Congress, published in French and German, and the Congress Bulletin, number 20, 1924. Okay, so those are the predecessor documents. I'm not going to go into them, but you should know them if you're interested in Italian communism. All right, the general questions. 1, the principle of communism. The key doctrines of the Communist Party are founded on Marxism, which the struggle against opportunist deviations reinstated and set in place as a cornerstone of the Third International. The Comintern. These consist of dialectical materialism as a method of conceiving the world and human history, the fundamental doctrines contained in Marx's Capital as a method of interpretation of the present-day capitalist economy, the programmatic formulations of the Communist Manifesto as a historical and political plan of emancipation of the world working class, the magnificent, victorious experience of the Russian Revolution, and the work of its leader Lenin, master of international communism, constitute the confirmation, the restoration, and consequent development of this system of principles and methods. It is not possible to be a communist or to militate in the ranks of the International, even if one part of this is rejected. So we have a maximal understanding and a maximal adherence to the program. But again, remember, Bordagists don't think that you purge factions, but the emergence of factions actually indicate a problem in understanding of the program. We'll come back to that. Consequently, the Communist Party rejects and condemns the doctrines of the dominant class, which range from spiritualistic and religious theories, idealist in philosophy and reactionary in politics, to those which are positivist and free-thinking Voltairian variety, so Voltaire, and anti-clerical and democratic in the realm of politics. So we see the beginning of the rejection of democracy. We see this earlier in the rejection of bourgeois democracy in Bordiga in 1922. There's a thing that you read on the democratic principle even that early. But he still sounds like Lenin, and like there are forms of democracy, proletarian democracy, that could be vouched for. This is abandoned by this time. It likewise condemns certain political schools which have the following against the working class: social democratic reformism, which cherishes peaceful transition without armed struggle from capitalist to workers' power, invoking class collaboration, syndicalism, which depreciates political activity of the working class and the need for the party as a supreme revolutionary organ, anarchism, which denies the historical necessity of the state and of the proletarian dictatorship as a means whereby the social order is transformed and class division suppressed. The Communist Party likewise opposes all the many manifestations of spurious revolutionism, which aims to resuscitate such tendencies by mingling them with the communist theses, a danger that is designed by now well-known term centrism. So we see here an argument with what would be called the Marxist center, which would be the ideas of Togliatti and of Gramsci. Although, remember that despite Bordagists later will make more and more hay of Gramsci, eventually even buying sort of myths about him, that in this time period, we are dealing with very clear, specific delineations of the center of the Marxist project. The nature of the party. The historical course of the proletariat's emancipation and the foundation of a new social order derives from the existence of class struggle. Every class struggle is a political struggle. That is to say, it has a tendency to end up as a struggle for the conquest of political power and control of the new state organism. You'll notice this organic language is something unique to Bordiga, is organic organism. We'll see this over and over again, and this is big to their conceptions of things like organic centralism. Consequently, the organ which leads to the class struggle to its final victory is the class political party, which is the sole possible instrument, firstly of the revolutionary insurrection and then of government. From these simple but brilliant assertions of Marx, brought into the maximum relief by Lenin, arises the definition of the party as the organization of all those who are conscious of the system of opinions in which is summed up the historical task of the revolutionary class who have decided to work for the victory of this class. So conscious partisans who are trying to make the class operate for itself. And again, this is not actually that different from classical communism. Thanks to the party, the working class acquires the knowledge of the way forward and the will to take it. This is vanguard theory going back to Kautsky. I know that Bordiga would be very uncomfortable with the fact it goes back to Kautsky and not Lenin, but it does. Historically, the party therefore represents the class in the successive stages of struggle, even if only a greater or smaller part of the class is regrouped in its ranks. So the party represents the height of communist struggle, even if it is a minority position. This equates with how Lenin defined party at the Second World Congress. Marx and Lenin's conception of party stands in sharp contrast to the typically opportunist conception of the laborist and workers' party, to whom all those individuals who are proletarian in terms of their social condition are admitted by right. Within such a party, even if exhibiting an apparent numerical strength, there may, and indeed in certain conditions there will, prevail the direct counter-revolutionary influence of the dominant class. You can almost feel this idea of class hegemony here. A class represented by the dictatorship of the organizers and leaders who are individuals can derive just as well from the proletariat as well as from other classes. This is the rejection of, I guess, of workerism. This is also why they don't play well with councilists or with Trotskyists. This is why Marx and Lenin fought against the fatal theoretical error and never hesitated to break up false proletarian unity in practice in order to ensure, even during moments when the social activity of the proletariat was eclipsed, and even by way of a small political groups of adherents of the revolutionary program, that would be continuity of the political function of the party in preparation for subsequent tasks of the proletariat. This is the only possible way to achieve in the future the concentration of the greatest possible section of the workers around the leadership and under the banner of the Communist Party, capable of fighting and winning. So we have here something a little different. The equation of Marx and Lenin's conception of party is slightly questionable. I say slightly. I wouldn't say that it's 100% questionable. But Marx doesn't talk that much about party. Only in dealing with the International Working Men's Association does that really come up. It comes up a little bit in the manifesto. But ideas of, say, centralism, while important to Marx, are not actually discussed in terms of party all that much. You get it in maybe the letters of Engels and some other places. Make of that what you will. An immediate organization of all workers on an economic basis cannot take on a political, that is revolutionary, task, since the separate and localized professional groups feel impelled to satisfy only the partial demands that arise as a direct consequence of capitalist exploitation, aka trade union consciousness. That's what this is here. Only with the direct intervention at the head of the working class of a political party, defined by the political adherents of its members, do we find the progressive synthesis of these particular impulses into a common vision and activity, whereby individual and groups are enabled to go beyond all particularisms and accept difficulties and sacrifices for the final and general triumph of the working class cause. The definition of the party as class party of the working class is a final and historical value for Marx and Lenin, not a vulgarly statistical and constitutional one. AKA, it is the party of the program of Marx and Lenin that matters, because it represents the real interest of the working class, whether the working class likes it or not. That's what this is saying. And that's not actually that different from Bolshevik conceptions, at least early ones. Any conception of the problem of internal organization that leads to error of the laborist conception of the party reveals a serious theoretical deviation, in so much as it substitutes a democratic vision for a revolutionary one, and attributes more importance to utopian schemes for designing new organizations than to the dialectical reality of the collision of forces between two opposed classes. In other words, it represents the danger of relapsing into opportunism, as regards the perils of degeneration and of the revolutionary movement, and of means to guarantee that the required continuity of the political line in its leaders and members. These dangers can't be eradicated with organizational formulae. Less still, it is possible to eliminate them with a formula which states only authentic workers can be communist. This was an internal battle. A position contradicted in our own experience by a vast majority of examples related to both individuals and parties. I mean, asterisk, Marx says this in the manifesto, that any individual who throws his lot with the working class and those proletarianized, that's proletarianization is a word used in the manifesto, can also be involved with the party. So your class origins really aren't that important. And people try to make it important are really getting beyond the point. Now, this seems to be a little bit pushback on the generally conceived merger thesis, and we'll come back to that later. And seems to think that the idea of the communist as a historical reality is beyond even the class which needs to make it, which is an interesting thing to think about. And maybe we'll see where that goes later. But I would say this is kind of implied in both the Second International and the Third's definition of party. The aforementioned guarantee must be sought elsewhere if we don't wish to contradict the fundamental Marxist postulate. The revolution isn't a question of forms of organization. A postulate in which are summed up all the conquests achieved by scientific socialism with respect to the first rantings of utopianism. Our resolution to the current problems regarding the internal organization of the International and the party set out from these conceptions on the very nature of the class party. So far, if you are a Leninist or even a Second Internationalist who is frustrated with the way the Second International went, there is nothing for most people who aren't, say, councilists to object to here. Let's get into the next section, party tactics and party action. The way the party operates in response to specific situations and relates to other groups, organizations, and institutions of the society in which it moves constitute its tactics. The general elements of this question must be defined in relation to our overall principles. It is impossible on a secondary level to establish more concrete norms of action in relation to different types of practical problems and successive phases of historical development. By assigning to the Revolutionary Party its place and its role in the genesis of the new society, the Marxist doctrine provides the most brilliant of resolutions to the question of freedom and determination in the activity of mankind. I love that Marxists from this period can't speak without, like, hyperbole. Anyway, when extended to the abstract individual, however, the question will continue to furnish material for the metaphysical lubrications of the philosophers of the ruling and decadent class for years to come. Marxism, on the other hand, situates the problem in the correct light of scientific and objective conception of society and history. The idea that the individual, and indeed one individual, can act on the outside world and shape it and mold it at will, as though the power of initiative partook of some kind of divine inspiration in a million miles from our view. We equally condemn the voluntarist conception of the party, according to which a small group of men, after having forged for themselves a profession of faith, proceed to spread and impose it by gigantic effort of will, activity, and heroism. It would, on the other hand, be stupid and aberrant conception of Marxism to believe that the course of history and revolution proceed according to fixed laws, with nothing remaining for us to do apart from discovering what these laws might be through objective research and attempting to formulate predictions about the future while attempting nothing in the domain of action. The upshot of this fatalist conception is to annul the function of the party and indeed its very existence. Marxist determinism doesn't attempt to find a solution halfway between two solutions, but in its powerful originality arises above them both. Because it is dialectical and historical, it rejects all aphorisms and doesn't claim to be able to apply, regardless of the historical epoch or human groupings under consideration, one abstract solution to every problem. A lot of people need to hear that. If the current development of the sciences does not allow for the complete investigation of which it induces the individual to act, starting with the physical and biological facts to arrive at a science of psychological activity, it is nevertheless possible to resolve the problem in the field of sociology by applying to the problem, like Marx, the methods of investigation appropriate to the experimental and positive science fully inherited by socialism, and which are quite different from the self-styled materialistic and positivist philosophy adopted during the historical advances of the bourgeois class. By taking rational account of the reciprocal influences between individuals through the crucial study of economy and history, after having cleared the decks of every prejudice contained in the traditional ideologies, we can, in a certain sense, remove indeterminacy from the process operating within each individual. And with this, at the point of departure, Marxism has become able to establish an ideological system that isn't immutable and fixed gospel, but is a living instrument that enables the laws of historical process to be followed and recognized. By means of the economic determinism discovered by Marx, which forms the basis of the system, the study of economic forms and relationship, and the development of the technical means of production, provide us with an objective platform on which to make soundly based enunciations about the laws of social life, and to a certain degree, make predictions about its subsequent development. With this duly recorded, we must emphasize that the final solution doesn't mean we can say that having discovered universal key, we must let economic phenomenon follow their own immanent law, and a predictable and established series of political facts will inevitably take place. This is kind of taking aim at Bernstein and to some degree Lassalle. Undoubtedly, our critique is tantamount as a completely different and devoiding of any meaning the aims and perspective of individuals had in historical events. Yeah, I think that's an overstep. Even when such individuals are considered protagonists of historical deeds, though this does not completely apply to their actions. This, however, does not imply that a collective organism, such as a class party, could not and should not express initiatives of its own or have its own will. The solution we get to is countless times expressed in our fundamental text. Humanity, in its most powerful grouping, such as classes, parties, and states, have moved almost as if we were playthings in the grip of economic laws, up to now almost entirely unknown to them. These groupings at the same time have lacked theoretical awareness of the economic process and the possibility of managing and controlling it. However, the class that appears in the present historical epoch, the proletariat, and in political groupings which inevitably emanate from it, the party and the state, for them the problem is modified. This is because the proletariat is the first class that isn't driven to the base to its rise to power on the consolidation of social privilege and class divisions. The first not to subject and exploit another class anew, while at the same time it is the first to manage to shape a doctrine of social and historical development of the economy, in other words, Marxist communism. For the first time, then, a class fights for the suppression of classes in general and the suppression of property and means of production in general, rather than fighting for a mere transformation of the social forms of property. AKA, this is a very elaborate way of stating a basic Marxist premise, but one that is, I think most Marxists would agree on, that the proletariat is a revolutionary subject and is a subject of history because it could enable a class of society, because it has both no interest in new forms of property, but has the skills to reproduce itself both socially and economically. There you go. And thus, here you go. The proletariat's program, together with its emancipation from the present dominant and privileged classes, is the emancipation of human collectivity from the bondage to the laws of economy, which once understood can be dominated within an economy which is finally rational and scientific and which is subject to the direct intervention of man. This is what Engels meant when he wrote that the proletarian revolution marks a passage from the world of necessity to the world of freedom. This does not mean we resuscitate the illusory myths of individualism, which wishes to liberate the human ego from external influences, especially since these influences tend to become ever more complex and the life of the individual becomes ever more indistinguishably part of collective life. On the contrary, the parameters of the problem are changed, with will and freedom attributed to a class destined to become a unitary human grouping itself, a grouping which will one day struggle against the adverse forces of the physical world alone. So we have Prometheanism here. While only proletarian humanity, still in the future for us, will be free and capable of a will that isn't sentimental illusion, but the capacity to organize and master the economy in the broadest sense of the word. And whilst it is true that the proletarian class today still has the extent of its activity determined by influences external to it, though less so than other classes, the organ in which, on the contrary, is summed up to fulfill the extent of volitional possibilities and initiative in all fields of activity is the political party. So only political party matters. Not just any old party, though, but the party of the proletarian class, the Communist Party, linked as though by an unbroken thread to the ultimate goal in the future. The party's power of volition, as well as its consciousness and its theoretical knowledge, are functions of that exquisitely collective. Marxism explains that the leaders of the party itself are given their job because they are considered as instruments and operators who best manifest the capacity to comprehend and explain facts and will lead and will action with such capacities, nonetheless maintaining the origins and the existence and character of the collective organ. Again, this organic stuff really comes up. And this is where you can start seeing the beginnings of organic centralism. Here is the moment where you see something not quite new, but you can see where it's going to go to be new emerge. By way of these considerations, the Marxist concepts of the party and its activity, as we have stated, thus shuns fatalism, which would have us passively spectators of phenomena into which no direct intervention is felt possible. Likewise, it rejects every voluntarist conception as regards individuals, according to which qualities of theoretical preparation, force of will, and the spirit of sacrifice, in short, a special type of moral figure and a requisite level of purity, set the required standard for every single party militant without exception, reducing the latter to an elite, distant and superior to the rest of the elements who compose the working class. The fatalistic and pacifistic error, though it might not necessarily lead to negating the function and utility of the party, at the very least would certainly involve adopting the party to a proletarian class that is understood merely in a statistical and economic sense. We can sum up the conclusions touched on in the preceding theses as a condemnation of both the worker's conception and that of an elite intellectual and moral character. Both these tendencies are aberrations from Marxism, which would end up converging on a slippery slope to opportunism. In resolving the general question of tactics on the same terrain as that of the nature of the party, the Marxist solution must be distinguished both from the doctrinal estrangements from reality of the class struggle which contends itself with abstract lubrications, while negating concrete activity, and from sentimental aestheticism, which aspires with its noisy gestures and heroic posturing of tiny minorities to bring about new situations and historical movements. That's a swipe at anarchist. Also, it must be distinguished from opportunism, which neglects the link with principles, i.e., with the general scope of the movement, and in keeping in view only an immediate and apparent success, is content to clamor for isolated and limited demands without bothering whether or not these contradict the necessity of preparing for a supreme conquest of the working class. The mistake of anarchist politics derived from both from doctrinal sterility and its incapacity to comprehend the dialectical stages of real historical evolution, and from its voluntarist illusions, which cherish the fond hope of being able to spread the social processes by force of example, propaganda by the deed, and of sacrifices made by one or the many. The mistake of social democratic politics derives as much from the false conception of Marxism in holding that revolutions will mature slowly of its own accord without a revolutionary insurrection, willed by the proletariat, as it does from voluntarist pragmatism, which, unable to relinquish the immediate results of its day to initiatives and interventions, is happy to struggle for objectives which are only superficial interest to the proletarian groups. For once obtained, these objectives merely become parts of the game of conserving the dominant class rather than serving the preparation for the victory of the proletariat. Such objectives are partial reforms, concessions, and advantages, both political and economic, obtained from bosses and the bourgeois state. The artificial introduction into the class movement of the theoretical dictates of modern voluntarist and pragmatist philosophy, Bergson, Gentile, Croce, based on idealism, can only but prepare opportunist affirmations of new waves of reformism. It cannot be passed off as a reaction to reformism just because it demonstrates a superficial liking for bourgeois positivism. The party cannot and must not restrict its activity to either merely conserving the purity of theoretical principles and organizational structure. I think by the time we get to invariance, it's going to do that, guys. Sorry. Or to achieving immediate successes and the numerical popularity regardless of the cost. At all times and in all places, it must consolidate the following 3 points. A, the defense and clarification of the fundamental programmatic postulates, that is, the theoretical knowledge of the working class movement in relation to new events as they arise. B, the assurance of the continuity of organizational unity and efficiency of the party and its defense against contamination by extraneous influences opposed to revolutionary interests of the proletariat. And C, the active participation in all struggles of the working class, including those that arise out of partial limited interest, in order to encourage their development. Emphasis, however, must be constantly to be placed on the factor of their links with the final revolutionary aim and with the conquest of the class presented as a stepping stones on the way to an indispensable combat to come. This means denouncing the perils of abandoning ourselves to partial accomplishments as though they were the points of arrival, or the dangers of bartering these for the conditions of class unity and combativity of the proletariat, which are the autonomy and independence of its ideology and its organizations, most important of which is the party. The supreme purpose of this complex party activity is the creation of a subjective conditions for the proletariat's preparation, so that this in the position to profit from the revolutionary possibilities as soon as history presents them and emerge from the struggle victor rather than vanquished. This is the subjective versus objective conditions thing from Lenin. All this is to the point of departure for responding to the questions of the relations between the party and the proletarian masses, the party and other political parties, and the proletariat and other social classes. We must consider the following tactical formulations wrong. All true communist parties should, in all situations, strive to be mass parties. That is to say, always be organizations with huge memberships and a very widespread influence over the proletariat, such as to at least exceed that of the other self-styled workers' parties. Asterisk. Bordiga is going to give this up later, but it's important to hear. Such a proposal is a character of Lenin's practical, relevant, and eminently appropriate watchword of 1921. Namely, in order to conquer power, it isn't sufficient to form a genuine communist parties and launch them into an insurrectionary offensive, because what is needed are numerically powerful parties with predetermining influence over the proletariat. In other words, before the conquest of power and in the period leading up to it, the party must have the masses with it, must first of all conquer the masses. Such a formulation only becomes rather dangerous when it is used in conjunction with the idea of the notion of the majority of the masses, since it leads itself to such a chapter and verse Leninist, now as in the past, to the danger of social democratic interpretations of theory and tactics. For although expressing the perfectly correct idea that the dangerous practice of engaging in reckless actions and insufficient forces, or when the moment isn't right, must be avoided, the unspecificness about how the majority is to be measured, i.e. whether the party, the unions, or organs give rise to the opposite danger of being diverted from action when it is possible and appropriate, that is, at times when a truly Leninist resolution and initiative is required. AKA, we need the party to be mass, but we don't care that it's majoritarian. It has to conquer the masses, but it doesn't have to conform and have all of them in it. All right. The formula which states that the party must have the masses with it on the eve of struggle has now become typically opportunist formula in the facile interpretation of today's pseudo-Leninists when they assert that the party must, in all situations, be a mass party. There are objective situations when the balance of forces are unfavorable to revolution, although perhaps closer to the revolution in time than others. Marxism teaches us that the historical evolution takes place at very different rates. In these situations, the wish to be a majority party of the masses and enjoy an overriding political influence at all costs can only at such times be achieved by renouncing communist principle and methods and engaging in social democratic and petty bourgeois politics instead. AKA, for Bordiga, there's times in which you're just not worried about being a mass cadre because conditions are unfavorable to you. All right, that's what he's saying here. It must be emphatically stated that in certain situations, past, present, and future, the proletariat has, does, and inevitably will adopt non-revolutionary stance, either a position of inertia or collaboration with the enemy, as the case may be. But despite everything, the proletariat everywhere and always remains potentially a revolutionary class entrusted with the revolutionary stance, either entrusted with the revolutionary counterattack. But this is only insofar as it within there exists a communist party, and where, without ever renouncing coherent interventions when appropriate, the party avoids taking paths, while although apparently the easiest routes to instant popularity would divert it from its task and thereby remove the essential point of support for ensuring the proletariat's recovery. On dialectical and Marxist grounds as these, and never aesthetic and sentimental grounds, we reject the bestial expression of opportunism that maintains that a communist party is free to adopt all means and all methods. By some, it is said that precisely because the party is truly communist, sound in principles and organization, it can indulge in the most acrobatic of political maneuverings. But what this assertion forgets is that the party itself is both factor and product of historical development, and the even more malleable principle, and even the more malleable proletariat is yet more so. The proletariat will not be influenced by contorted justifications such as maneuvers offered by party leaders, but by actual results. And the party must know how to anticipate these results mainly by using the experience of past mistakes. It is not just theoretical credos and organizational sanctions that the party will be guaranteed against generation, but by acting correctly in the field of tactics and by making a determined effort to block off false paths with precise and respected norms of action. When the tactical spirit, there is another error which clearly leads back to the classical opportunist position dismantled by Marx and Lenin. This consists in asserting, in the case of struggles between classes and political organizations, which take place outside the party's specific terrain, that the party must choose to side with which representatives the development of the situation are most favorable to the general historical evolution, and should more or less openly support and coalesce with it. AKA, this is a critique of the Popular Front from above. It is also a basis of critique of the United Front from above. It is also a basis of the critique of the Popular Front that you find in both Trotsky and Bordiga. The pretext for this is the conditions for the complete proletarian revolution to be set in motion by the party when the time occurs, which will have arrived solely when there has been sufficient maturation and evolution of political and social forms. For a start, the very presumptions that lie behind such politics are at fault. The typical scheme of social and political evolution, fixed down to the smallest detail, as allegedly providing the best preparation for the final event of communism, belongs to the opportunist brand of Marxism and is the basis on which the various Kautsky's set about defaming the Russian Revolution and the present communist movement. It isn't even possible to establish in the general way the most propitious conditions for a communist party work to bear fruit are to be found under conditions certain types of bourgeois regime, i.e. the most democratic. For while it is true that the reactionary and right-wing measures of bourgeois governments have often obstructed the proletariat, it is no less true, and in fact occurs far more often, that the liberal and left-wing politics of the bourgeois governments also have stifled the class struggle and diverted the working class from taking decisive action. A more accurate evaluation, truly conforming with Marxism's break of the democratic evolutionist and progressive spell, maintains that the bourgeoisie attempts and often succeeds in altering its methods and parties and governing according to counter-revolutionary interest. All our experience shows us that whenever the proletariat gets enthusiastic about the vicissitudes of bourgeois politics, opportunism triumphs. I agree with this paragraph a lot. All right, anyway. Second, even if it is true that certain changes of government within the present regime made the further development of proletarian action easier, there is a clear evidence that this would depend on one express condition: the existence of a party which had issued timely warnings to the masses about the disappointment which would inevitably follow what have appeared to be an immediate success. Indeed, not just the existence of a party, but its capacity to take action even before the struggle to which we refer, in a manner which clearly perceived as autonomous by proletarians who follow the party not on the basis of schemes which it might be convenient to adopt at an official level, but because the party's down-to-earth attitude, when faced with the struggles unable to culminate the definitive proletarian victory, the party doesn't turn itself into a manager of transitional demands and accomplishments which are not of direct interest to the class it represents, and neither does it barter away the specific character and autonomous activity in order to become a kind of insurance society for all political renewal movements or political systems and governments under threat from an allegedly worse government. AKA, fuck lesser evilism. The requirement of this line of action are often falsified by invoking Marxist formula that communism supports any movement directed against the existing social conditions, and the whole Lenin's doctrine directed against the infantile disorder of communism. The speculations attempted on these declarations of Marx and Lenin within our movement are substantially similar to the analogous speculations continually indulged by revisionists and centrists of the Bernstein and Natai stamp, or Ninny stamp, who, in the name of Marx and Lenin, have mocked revolutionary Marxism. We must make two observations. First of all, Marx and Lenin's positions have contingent historical value since they refer to Marx's case to a pre-bourgeois Germany, and in Lenin's case is illustrated in left-wing communism. It's interesting that Bordega cited in left-wing communism critically, but he cites it positively. It's interesting that he does that. An infantile disorder to the Bolshevik experience in Tsarist Russia. We shouldn't base our resolutions on tactical questions under classical conditions, i.e. the proletariat in conflict with fully developed capitalist bourgeoisie, on these foreign nations alone. So this is where Bordega basically says we can be more Leninist than Lenin because we exist in a fully bourgeois society as opposed to Tsarist Russia or pre-revolutionary Germany. Secondly, the support to which Marx refers and Lenin's compromises, Lenin as a great Marxist dialectician and champion of real, non-formal intransience aimed and directed at an immutable goal, like to flirt with such terms, are to support and compromise with movements still forced to clear the way forward with their insurrection against past social formations, even if this does contradict their ideology and long-term aims of their leaders. AKA, I have a reason to explain why Lenin and Marx aren't doing what I'm saying here. That they live in pre-bourgeois societies and had to make concessions to that, and we don't have to in Italy. The intervention of the Communist Party, therefore, occurs as an intervention in the setting of a civil war. And this explains Lenin's position on the peasant and national question during the Kornilov affair and in 100 other cases. These two key observations aside, neither Lenin's criticism of infantilism nor any Marxist text on the suppleness of revolutionary politics was ever meant to undermine the barrier deliberately erected against opportunism, defined by Engels and later by Lenin as absence of principles and obliviousness of the final goal. Constructing communist tactics with formalist rather than dialectical method is a repudiation of Marx and Lenin. It is, therefore, a major error to assert that the means should correspond to the ends by way of their historical and dialectical succession in the process of development. But depending on similarities and analogous aspects that means and ends may assume in certain immediate sense, and which we might call ethical, psychological, and aesthetic, we don't need to make it in the field of tactics the mistake in the realm of principle by anarchists and reformists, to whom it seems absurd both that the suppression of class and state power is prepared by the way of the predominance of proletarian class in its dictatorship, and that the abolition of all social violence is realized by employing both offensive and defensive revolutionary violence by the existing power and conservative towards the proletarian power. By the way, this is the mention of offensive and defensive revolutionary violence is kind of a take at the Second International, which was okay with fighting a defensive revolution, but not an offensive one. Anyway, and that wasn't true for all the Second International, but it was kind of the SPD stance. And it would be just as mistaken to make the following assertions: that a revolutionary party must support every struggle without taking into account the strengths of friends and foes, that communists must inevitably champion a strike to the bitter end, and that communists must shun the means of dissimulation, trickery, espionage, etc., because they aren't particularly noble or pleasant. Marxism and Lenin's critique of the superficial pseudo-revolutionism that fouls the path of the proletariat consists of an attempt to eliminate these stupid and sentimental criteria as ways of resolving the problem of tactics, and their critique has now definitively acquired experience of the communist movement. One tactical error that this critique allows us to avoid is the following: since communists aim for a political split with the opportunist, we should therefore support splitting off from the trade unions led by the supporters of the Yellow Amsterdam Union. This is a merely polemical trickery that has misrepresented the Italian left as basing its conclusions on notions like it is undignified to meet opportunist leaders in person, and so on. This is a Bordega stance that you can work with even corrupt trade unions, but you can't work with political parties. Thus, the United Front from Below, as it's called in Marxist-Leninist categories during third periodism. It is identical to that. Bordega wouldn't call it that. All right. The critique of infantilism doesn't, however, mean that its indeterminacy, chaos, and arbitrariness must govern tactics, or that all means are appropriate for achieving our aims. That is to say that the harmony between means employed and the ultimate objective is guaranteed by the revolutionary nature of the party. This is going to be a problem when the party splits, man, and by the contributions that the eminent men and groups backed by the brilliant tradition will bring in its decision making, just as a non-Marxist playing with words, because it doesn't take into account the repercussions of the party, which its actions will have in dialectical play of cause and effect. It also ignores the fact that Marxism ascribes no value whatsoever to the intentions that dictate the initiatives of individuals or groups. And the bloody experience of the past means we cannot avoid being suspicious about what lies behind these intentions, though we don't need to mean that in an insulting way. In his pamphlet on the infantile disorder of communism, Lenin wrote that the tactical means must be chosen in advance in order to fulfill the revolutionary objective and governed by clear historical vision of the proletarian struggle and its final goal. He showed that it would be absurd to reject some tactical expedient just because it seemed nasty or was deserving the definition of compromise, and that it was, on the contrary, necessary to decide whether or not each tactic fitted with the achieving its final goal. The collective activity of the party and the Communist International poses and will continue to pose this formidable task. In matters of theoretical principle, we can say that Marx and Lenin have bequeathed us a sound heritage, although that isn't to say there aren't many new tasks of theoretical research for communism to accomplish. In tactical matters, on the other hand, we can't say the same. Even after the Russian Revolution, the experience of the first years of life of the new international, which was deprived of Lenin all too soon, the question of tactics is much too complex to be resolved by simplistic and sentimental answers of communist infantiles. This is aimed at cancel communists, I think. And he's also using this text critiquing him here so that you can't throw out, well, Lenin mocked you in a prior Congress. He's using it here for a reason. He's trying to show that he's actually consistent with Lenin. And it requires an in-depth contribution from the whole of the international communist movement by light of its experience, old and new. Marx and Lenin aren't being contradicted if we state in order to resolve this question, rules of conduct must be followed which, while not as vital and fundamental as principles, are nonetheless binding on both party members and leading organs of the movement, who should forecast the different ways in which the situations may develop, as so to plan with the greatest possible degree of accuracy how the party should act when one of these hypothetical scenarios assumes specific dimensions. Comprehending and weighing up to the situation has to be the key requirement for making tactical decisions, because this allows us to signal to the movement that the time has come for action, which has already been anticipated as far as possible. It doesn't, however, allow for arbitrary improvisations and surprises on the part of the leaders. Cough, cough. That's clearly aimed at Stalin, Gramsci, Togliatti, the French party, etc. We can't predict with absolute certainty how objective situations will turn out, but we can predict what we should do in certain hypothetical situations. That is to say, we can predict tactics in the broadest outline, our broad outline. To deny this possibility and necessity would be both to deny both the fundamental party duty and to reject only the assurance we can give that in all circumstances, party militants and the masses will agree to take orders from the leading center. In this sense, the party is not like an army or any other state mechanism, for in these organs hierarchical authority prevails in voluntary given situation, even when the leading center doesn't have the time to consult the party. Still less the masses, the tactics are such that they don't lead to unexpected repercussions inside the party itself and within the proletariat. And they don't go, in a sense, opposed to the success of the revolutionary campaign. The art of predicting how the party will react to orders and which orders will be received is the art of revolutionary tactics. These tactics can only be relied upon if they collectively utilize the experience of the past summed up in clear rules of action, and if the membership, having entrusted the fulfillment of this task later to its leaders, is convinced that these will not betray their mandate and are generally and decisively, not just apparently, engaged in the work of carrying out the movement's orders. We have no hesitation in saying that since the party itself is something perfectible, but not perfect, much has to be sacrificed for the clarity's sake to the persuasive capacity of the tactical norms, even if this does entail a certain schemization. For even when the tactical schemes prepared by us collapse under the rate of circumstances, the matter is never remedied by relapsing into opportunism and eclecticism, but rather by renewed efforts to bring tactics back into line with the duties of the party. It isn't only the good party that makes good tactics, but good tactics make a good party, and good tactics have to be amongst those everyone has chosen and everybody has understood in their main outlines. You can already see here why there is both a rejection of factions, but no want of faction bans, because it would imply that the party is out of alignment with its mission and also its masses. All right. Now, I think that's great theoretically. I have no idea how you practically do that. But anyway, back to the text. Basically, what we are rejecting is the difficult work of the party in collectively defining its tactical norms should be stifled by demands of unconventional obedience to one man, one committee, or one particular party of the International and its traditional apparatus of leadership. AKA, we don't have to listen to what the Bolsheviks say under Stalin. That's what this is saying. The activity of the party takes on strategic aspects and culminating moments for the struggle for power, at which point it assumes an essential military character. Even in the preceding phase, the party's activity is not restricted merely to the ideological, propagandistic, and organizational functions, but consists, as we have already mentioned, of active participations in various proletarian struggles. This being so, the system of tactical norms must therefore be constructed with the precise aim of establishing under what conditions the intervention and activity of the party in such movement, its agitation, in the life of the proletarian struggles harmonizes with the final revolutionary objective, while simultaneously guaranteeing useful purpose in the spheres of ideological, organizational, and tactical preparation. In the next part, we will take the particular problems and examining how our elaboration of particular norms of the communist activity relates to the present stage of development of the revolutionary moment. Now, I said earlier that this is where Bordegism begins, and we can see the hints of it, but certain concepts haven't come up yet. We haven't hit invariant program. We haven't hit organic centralism. We haven't hit the party as the brain of the proletariat, although we've hit the organic metaphor a lot here. We still have what is basically classical Leninism here so far, except that saying that certain things that Lenin did in Russia or that Marx encouraged in pre-bourgeois Germany aren't applicable to us today. And that we must not give in to opportunists. But this is a surprisingly diplomatically worded draft thesis for a party, and one that is mostly based, so far, on things that were already accepted by the Comintern or by classical Marxism in its participation in the Second International. Now, on that note, we're going to end for the day, because we're already about to hit an hour. We have a lot more of this text to go through. We haven't got to the stuff. We just have hints of what's going to become Bordegism, or the Bordegas current, or the Italian left communism, call it what you want, later on.